We're happy to welcome you to our show tonight, Polygamy, What Love Is This? I'm your host, Doris Hanson, and the question of love is particularly sensitive tonight as we deal with some difficult issues, the subject being basically incest and also a very twisted polygamous family tree. We want you to know there is life after polygamy, and we would like to be able to show you that we can offer you a support system as well as help getting out and help after you get out. So call our toll-free number if you have questions or you'd like to talk about your situation, and that number is 877-425-9993 for information about how we can help you if you're in a polygamy group and are interested in leaving. Incest was an early Mormon polygamous belief and practice and continues in polygamy groups today. I'd like to quote from a book by D. Michael Quinn entitled Mormon Hierarchy Extensions of Power. And I'm quoting from July 15, 1886, where Apostle Lorenzo Snow prophesies from the pulpit that in the future, he said, brothers and sisters would marry each other in this church. All our horror at such a union was entirely due to prejudice, and the offspring of such unions would be as healthy and pure as any other, he said. Now, these were the decided views of President Young when he was alive, for Brother Snow talked to him freely on this matter, end quote. If Lorenzo Snow had been talking about anything, any kind of marriage other than incest between brothers and sisters, he would never have made the remark that people would be horrified at such an idea. From Joseph Smith, who practiced incest by marrying mothers and daughters, and he married several pair of those, and he also married several pairs of sisters, which God prohibits, to Brigham Young, who is guilty of the same activity, to Lorenzo Snow, we find early Mormon leadership condoned incest both by practice and by preaching. And so we don't wonder that despite God forbidding incest and the laws of the land also forbidding incest, that some contemporary polygamy groups snub their noses at God's command and at the laws of the land and follow the early Mormon example instead. In the book entitled Expose of Polygamy in Utah, A Lady's Life Among the Mormons, which was published in 1872, we read from chapter 10, quote, "It is quite a common thing in Utah for a man to marry 2 and even 3 sisters. I was very well acquainted with one man who married his half-sister, and I know of several who have married mother and daughter. I know also a man who married a widow with several children, and when one of the girls had grown into her teens, he insisted on marrying her too. To this very day, this daughter bears children to her stepfather, living in the same house with her mother. A rather prominent man in Salt Lake City," she said. "He has several wives and several married daughters. Only a few weeks ago married a young girl, 15 years old. A child that was his first wife had adopted and brought up as her very own. He married her," end quote. And so we see that this is just a slight sampling of polygamist incest in early Mormon polygamy. And we would like to ask the question here that perhaps polygamists would ask themselves: why did the early Mormon and why do the present day Mormon polygamists use the Old Testament as their mandate to justify the practice of polygamy, but they will not allow that same Old Testament to regulate their polygamist activities? You can read Leviticus chapter 18, and you can also read many verses in Leviticus chapter 20 that prohibits incestuous activities. Why don't they pay attention to those as well? Now we're going to look at some fruit from this early Mormon root. Let's fast forward about 130 years or so and take a look at some more recent polygamist behavior. Not too many years ago, there was a polygamist by the name of Tom Green, and he made news headlines because of his polygamist activities. His first wife was only 13 years old when he married her. Her name was Linda. Then he married Linda's mother, Beth. Next, he married a niece of one of his wives, 15-year-old Shirley. Then he married Shirley's mother, June, and then he married June's other daughter, Leanne. By 1993, Tom Green had a total of 7 wives: Beth and her daughter Linda, June and her 2 daughters, Leanne and Shirley, and then he married Carrie and Hannah, and they also were sisters. And so we wonder if this is taking all in the family to a whole new level. The 2 older wives, Beth and June, later left Tom Green, which left him with 5 wives. And all 5 of these wives were at least 24 years younger than Tom Green. And so we have incest, and the word pedophile also comes to mind. Okay, now let's look at another product from early Mormon root. We're going to go to rickross.com on the internet, where I got this one, and this happened in 2008. It's a news item entitled, LeBaron Brothers Team with Lawmaker in Effort to Change Incest Laws. 3 sons of a southern Utah fundamentalist say their dad fostered at least 4 children with his own daughter and is getting away with it because of a legal loophole. We have DNA evidence to prove that my dad is having children with my sister, one of them said. The LeBaron brothers, none of whom are polygamists, are exposing these painful family secrets. They believe incest is widespread beyond their eccentric family and is rarely prosecuted. He says many polygamy groups preach and practice incest. Let's go to another news item from rickross.com. We retrieved this news item, and it was published in 1999 in the Salt Lake Tribune, entitled, Kingston Gets Maximum Term and Lecture on Incest. David Ortel Kingston was convicted of having sex with his 16-year-old niece, who was his 15th wife. He was ordered to serve 2 consecutive terms, 0 to 5 years, in the Utah State Prison. In imposing the maximum penalty, the judge particularly condemned the incestuous practices of the Kingston clan. You have been taught in some way that relationship with nieces as plural wives are acceptable, and that's flat out not true, he said. An investigation by the Salt Lake Tribune revealed several instances of Kingston leaders marrying half-sisters, first cousins, nieces, and aunts as part of their religious beliefs. Most polygamist groups say that the Kingstons are the only group that incorporates incest into its religion. This news article goes on to say that if a child is conceived in an incestuous relationship, it faces a greater risk of being born with birth defects. Now we've set the stage for our discussion tonight. But before I introduce our guest tonight, I'd like to read a quote from a book entitled Keep Sweet by Debbie Palmer on page 9. Now this is a description of what a twisted polygamist family tree looks like. This is a true description. This is not contrived, but you must listen very carefully or you're going to miss some of the twists and the turns. Quote, my father had 6 wives, and I have 47 brothers and sisters, she says. My oldest daughter is my aunt, and I am her grandmother. When I was assigned to marry my first husband, I became my own step-grandmother since my father was already married to 2 daughters of my new husband. According to the eternal laws of the polygamy group I grew up with, I will be a step-grandmother to many of my own brothers and sisters for time and all eternity. Several of my stepsons were assigned to marry my sisters, so I also became a sister-in-law to my own stepchildren. After my mother's father was assigned to marry one of my second husband's daughters as a second wife, I became my own great-grandmother. This stepdaughter became my step-grandmother and I her stepmother, so when I gave birth to 2 sons with her father, my own sons became my great-uncles and I was their great-great-grandmother, end quote. Does anyone want to try and figure that one out? Do we have anyone in our viewing audience who would like to graph this family tree and send it to us? We'd like to see it. And I say, folks, this is polygamy. And we have a short clip here we would like to show you about this kind of a family tree.
Hello. Right here, at this point, in the original filming of this TV show, on TV 20 in Salt Lake City, Utah, a song was played called I'm My Own Grandpa. It's an old song. Many of you over 50 will remember it. It's about a guy who marries a beautiful woman who has a daughter. Later, the daughter falls in love with this guy's father. Both couples have a son. The relationship becomes very confusing as he explains in the melody how he now has become his own grandpa. So, is it all relative? The song was used to illustrate how complicated relationships can be when people start marrying people that are directly or indirectly related to them. And the more people that are indirectly or directly related to them, the greater the concept of relativity. For educational purposes, that song was used. It's very cute. We can't use it here because it's a copyright infringement if we put it on YouTube. But the point being, you understand the nonsense and the fun of the explanations of the song through complicated intermarriage, which is the point. Please enjoy the rest of this film.
And so we chuckle at a song like this, but it certainly is close to the truth, and we've all heard the saying that truth is more strange than fiction, I think that the saying is. But at any rate, there's not really enough shows and there's not enough time for us to fully uncover and discuss all the abuse, the incest, and disastrous results that have surfaced as a result of polygamist inbreeding. But to help us discuss some of it tonight is a very sweet, a very soft-spoken and knowledgeable lady who has been with it, seen much of it, and she knows a lot about it. She's the daughter of a previous polygamist leader of the Kingston Polygamy Group. Both her mother and her father are now deceased. She frequently attends our monthly discussion group and is a great inspiration to us and a very good friend of mine. I'd like to welcome to our show and introduce to our viewers Connie Rugg.
Thank you, Doris.
Thank you for coming. It's a subject that's hard to deal with, and it takes bravery and courage to do what you're doing tonight, and I want to thank you, Connie.
Thanks.
For coming and doing this. So would you briefly tell our viewers about your polygamist heritage and how you escaped from its grip?
I grew up in the Kingston family, and I left when I was 17 rather than be the fifth wife of one of the polygamists.
Would it have been a relative?
It would have been a relative, and I was told that I had to marry a Kingston. Even though there were other families in the group, a Kingston was all that was acceptable.
And so you would have been inbreeding had you
Yes.
married this person. Okay.
Yes.
How many wives did your father have? Do you know?
13 is the most used number, but there were some that left, and the number changes up and down.
There's so many secrets that go on. Sometimes
Right.
you really don't know the whole truth. How many children did your mother have, and how many brothers and sisters do you have?
My mother had 13 children, 3 of whom are deceased. 2 were young mothers that didn't receive medical care and left babies. My one sister that recently died left 9 children.
Oh my.
And if she would have seen a doctor, she would have been fine.
They just don't pick up on the medical help like they should either. Are you shut out from having a family relationship with your family that is still in the group?
That's a hard question. I could have a relationship with them, but ideas, our beliefs are so different that it's not attractive for me, and they don't want me to have contact with their children because I would be a bad influence on their children.
Yeah, they're afraid that you're going to corrupt them or lead them astray.
Show them that there is life outside of the group that can be good.
Yeah, and it can be very good. Your father firmly believed in pure bloodline, and he believed and taught and practiced incest. Would you explain how he came to believe it and how he came to incorporate incest into the theology of the Kingston polygamy group?
Yeah, and I'm sure that the early Mormon teachings were the basis of his ideas. But he also raised cattle, he raised pigeons, and he knew that through inbreeding you get a stronger bloodline. If you're going to raise prize-winning dogs or horses, you're going to inbreed to strengthen the traits that you want, and that's what he thought he was doing. He also talked about if you do inbreed, you're going to have, for every 10 children, you're going to have one that is a genius. But he also acknowledged that there could be several mistakes in those 10 children. And he believed that that was acceptable.
So the mistakes were worth it to get a
Yes.
genius. So do you think 10% of the Kingston group are classified as genius?
No.
But there's been a lot of mistakes.
Yes.
A lot of inbreeding
Yes.
mistakes. Well, let's talk about some of the genetic mistakes that happen as a result of inbreeding. But we're going to start first with the fumarase deficiency that seems to be plaguing the FLDS community in Colorado City.
Right, and the disease itself is very rare in the world. Arizona has about half of the cases of fumarase deficiency patients
Of the whole world.
in the whole world, and Arizona is where the FLDS are located.
Now, the victims of fumarase deficiency, they have suffer a range of symptoms, and this would include the inability to walk or even sit upright, epileptic seizures, severe speech impediments, failure to grow at the proper rate or at the normal rate, and some of them have some tragic physical deformities.
Right, right, and the recessive gene that triggers the disease has spread to thousands of individuals living in the FLDS community because of decades of inbreeding. And if both parents carry this gene, then it's more likely that their children will be affected. It's believed that more than half of the residents of the FLDS community carry this gene.
Wow.
Most of the children born with fumarase deficiency do not survive infancy. Those that do survive often suffer debilitating conditions and require constant care. They're unable to walk or care for themselves.
And they have, I don't even know, they had what, 20 cases, or there were 20 cases in the world, and they had 13 of them or something like that. It was an inordinate amount.
That was in the 1990s. There has been a lot of them in the last 20 years.
And one of the remarks was that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that they
Right.
haven't even seen anything from as a result of this yet, because their gene pool is filled with this genetic deficiency.
Right.
Now, the Kingston group has also been inbreeding now for about 4 generations.
4
I think
generations.
they're at. And we're talking about severe inbreeding here. We're not talking about an occasional second or third cousin. We're
Right.
talking about brothers and sisters, half siblings, aunts and uncles getting, or it would be uncle and nieces getting married, and nephews and aunts getting married.
Right,
and
in my
first
father's
cousins.
generation, it would have been uncle and niece. My father did marry one half-sister. Most of the focus has been on my father's children, and quite a few of them have married half-brother and sister, cousins, nieces, uncles, aunts.
And that's the first generation, and then the second generation. I know of some where there's an uncle and niece marriage, and then their children they will have deformities, and those children will marry half brothers and sisters
Right.
and
So
have kids. So
right
we've
now they're
got
in the 4th generation of inbreeding.
Of the inbreeding. That's pretty dangerous. What diseases or deformities have they seen in the Kingston group as a result from this systematic generational inbreeding that you can tell us about? Now, we're not going to use people's names
Right.
at all. We don't want to embarrass anybody, but
Right.
the fact is they are having many bad cases
Yes,
of birth
there's
defects.
Down syndrome, microcephaly with first cousins. There are lots of kids with no fingernails, retardation, blindness, autism, rare blood diseases. One severe enough that the young child needed chemotherapy.
And this was one mother. Didn't one mother have
One
4
mother,
children with
yes.
this problem?
Yes, with a rare blood disease. Kidney disease. I know of one mother that had 3 young children with severe kidney disease requiring transplants, and 3 out of 3 children. She finally left because she didn't want to have more children with this kind of problem. There was an albino baby. Stories, there are babies with missing limbs, missing eyes. Lots of stillbirths, lots of babies die right after birth.
I heard one woman say that a baby was born, they didn't even describe, they just said it was kind of like a monster. It was just so deformed. And of course it didn't live.
Right, and a lot of their babies don't live.
And most of these deformities that you've talked about are from half-brother and sister marriages and
Cousins.
niece and uncle marriages.
And brother and sister.
Now, I've heard some remarks from some of the people within the group that will say, well, there's deformities born from people outside of polygamy groups. You can't blame that
Right.
on what we're doing.
Right, but in these unions, sometimes there are more than 50% of their children have serious problems. And sometimes every child born in these unions has serious problems.
Has some kind of a problem. And children are born at home
They're born at home.
the Kingston group. So when a deformed baby is born, sometimes they will just let it die, or it will just die on its own, and then the baby will die. It's not issued a birth certificate. They just quietly bury it.
Officially, it never existed.
Officially, it didn't
they
exist.
used to use midwives. Now it's mostly the father of the child that delivers the baby. And these fathers don't have any medical training other than what they teach themselves. And
Now, when they let the babies die, there's no record. There's no one knows except for just these few people that
mother
are there.
is always left with the question of what was wrong with the child. Sometimes there's no visible
won't
problem.
know.
And there's always the question of, was it something simple that could have been taken care of?
At the if they took it to a doctor or the
Right.
hospital. Didn't someone you know want to let one of the babies die, but it didn't happen?
Yes, years ago, I was present. I arrived right after the birth of a child that was severely handicapped, and the father of the child was holding it in his hands, and it was obvious he was looking at the child and could see the handicaps and was going to let the baby die. It was obvious he was not going to revive it or try to save that baby. But there was a midwife present at that time, and she saw the same thing I did, and she took a blanket, put it around the baby, took it out of the father's hands and says, "We're taking this to the hospital. We're taking this baby to the hospital. You stay and take care of the mother." And that child is still alive now, and in her 20s.
A mature adult, and she did have some difficulties, but they've all been overcome through surgeries or medical
Right.
attention.
Right.
And now she lives a full life. Oh my. So when mothers have these deformed babies because of inbreeding, and like we talked about, many of the mothers will have more than one child, have several children like this. Many times the problem is blamed on her.
Right. Maybe she didn't eat right. Maybe she didn't obey her husband. Maybe she did something that her husband wants her to feel guilty for. So if it's her fault, then
Then she gets the blame for it.
she gets the blame for it.
Even
and-
though it's genetic, they won't admit it. They'll give her the blame.
But if she was worthy in God's eyes, it wouldn't have happened. And that's what they believe. They believe that God is guiding them, and this is God's way of rewarding or punishing them.
And so they take absolutely no consequence, personal consequence, for the genetic inbreeding that all medical personnel would know is
Right.
the reason for this
Primary
disastrous
Children's
results.
has several of these babies every year, and Utah, the state of Utah, is paying a fortune to take care of these babies.
I met a woman one time, I won't say who she was or what store we were in, but she recognized me from the show. She was a nurse up at the university hospital, and she said, you know, I see these babies all the time. I see the
Right.
mothers, they look so sad, they look so hopeless, and you ought to see some of the sad children, the sad cases that we see